Students can know the right financial terms and still not be financially ready. That is because theory is usually cleaner than life. Awareness without readiness creates false confidence, and I think this is one of the most important concerns, because freedom does not automatically produce maturity. It reveals whether maturity is present. Welcome to Leaven Academy. We're here to help you achieve your goals with expert guidance and support. Students can know the right financial terms and still not be financially ready, because financial knowledge answers the question, do you know? But financial readiness answers a much harder question. Can you decide well when it actually matters? And for older youth, that difference becomes more serious the moment freedom increases. I think this is one of the biggest blind spots in financial literacy education. Because in school settings, students can often define financial concepts correctly in class. They can sound very financially informed. They can explain the right idea, they can use the right vocabulary. But that doesn't always mean they are ready to make wise financial decisions once the situation becomes less structured, more personal, more open-ended. And I think schools need to see that distinction more clearly. If this video helped you think more clearly about how to develop young people well, please do me a quick favor. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or your experience, or any questions you actually have. It really helps more parents, educators, and school leaders discover this content, and it also helps me know what topics would serve you best next. Thank you very much for watching. In my experience, one of the recurring patterns is this. Some students sound financially informed during guided discussion. They respond well. They seem to understand the concept. They know what responsible financial behavior is supposed to sound like. But the moment the scenario introduces more freedom, more options, more competing priorities, the quality of the judgment changes. And that is where the issue becomes clearer. Because the problem is not always that students know too little. Very often, the problem is that we are mistaking financial knowledge for financial readiness. And those two things aren't the same. So in schools, look at financial literacy outcomes. I think one of the important questions to ask is this. Are we measuring whether students can explain the idea? Or are we measuring whether they are actually becoming ready to decide well when autonomy increases? Because those two things can look very similar in class, but they can separate quite quickly once real freedom enters the picture. The framework I want to use in this video is very simple. Knowledge, readiness, decision pressure. Knowledge asks, do you know the concept? Readiness, can you use judgment when the choice becomes real? And decision pressure asks, what happens to your judgment when freedom, convenience, social influence, or immediate reward enter the picture? That three-part distinction matters a lot. Because a student may know the concept long before they are ready for the freedom attached to it. And I think that is especially important for older youth. Because the older students get, the more financial decisions come less supervised, less obvious, more private, and more tied to autonomy. So if schools want to prepare students well, we cannot assume that correct terminology means that they are ready. Here is one simple question I think schools can start asking immediately. What kind of financial freedom is this student actually being prepared for? That question matters because it forces us to think beyond exposure. If the answer is simply, we want students to know terms, then we may be preparing them for a discussion, but not necessarily for autonomy. And I think that is where schools need to push further, because financial literacy becomes much more meaningful when it prepares students not just to speak correctly about money, but to think clearly when they are faced with real options, real trade-offs, and real pressure. The first issue is this. Knowledge is not the same as readiness. A student can understand a financial idea in theory and still not be ready to use it well in practice. That is because theory is usually cleaner than life. In theory, Students may know why spending sounds like. They may know what prioritizing sounds like. They may know how to explain the concept correctly when the teacher asks the question. But readiness is not tested by what the students say. Readiness is tested when the student has to decide without being guided step by step. And that is where the gap often becomes more visible. Two students may both understand the same financial concept in theory, both may sound equally informed during a discussion, both may appear to have understood the lesson, but when faced with a realistic decision, one slows down and weighs the consequence, while the other is quickly swayed by convenience, social influence, or immediate reward. That gap is not mainly the vocabulary used, it is actually judgment. And that is why I think schools need to be careful not to confuse conceptual understanding with practical readiness. Now, this doesn't mean theory is unimportant. Theory matters, concept matters, language does matter. But theory alone cannot tell us how stable a student's judgment is once that choice widens. So I think a better question for schools is not only can the students explain the idea, but also what would readiness look like here beyond the correct explanation? Because financial knowledge tells you what the student can say. Financial readiness tells you about how the student might decide. The second issue is this. Readiness gets exposed when the freedom increases. This is where the older youth become especially important because as students grow older, more financial decisions become self managed. There is often more privacy, more convenience, more access, more room to justify what they want, more competing priorities, and more situations where the choice is not going to be fully structured by the adult. And that is where judgment becomes very visible. In a guided classroom task, students may appear steady. The question is clear. The options are controlled. The teacher's explanation are very visible. The answer space feels relatively safe. But when the scenario becomes more open ended, more realistic, more autonomy driven, that steadiness can become much less certain. And I've seen that pattern repeatedly. Some students sound financially informed during a guided discussion. Great. When the scenario introduces more freedom, more priorities, more competing priorities, actually, the quality of the judgment changes. It doesn't necessarily mean the lesson had no value, but it does mean the school now has better information about what not had yet been formed, and that is useful. If a school is thinking more seriously about how to develop student behavior, not just student understanding, I've put together a practical resource to help you think through this more clearly. You can download it using the link below. It will give you a clearer starting point for strengthening how this is taught and formed in students. Because freedom does not automatically produce maturity, it reveals whether maturity is present. Now, of course, schools cannot simulate every real life situation. That is a fact. But schools can design far better for widened choice than they sometimes do now. They can create scenarios where there is more than one attractive option, where convenience competes with prudence, where social influence is present, where there is no perfect answer, and where students must justify not only what they choose, but why. That is where judgment starts becoming more visible. So I think schools need to ask, what happens to student judgment when structure is removed? Because that question is much closer to readiness than a neat classroom response alone. The third issue is this. Awareness without readiness creates false confidence. And I think this is one of the most important concerns because when the students sound informed, it can create reassurance too early. The student sounds knowledgeable. The program appears successful. The school feels encouraged. But the underlying decision, readiness, may still be weak. And that is risky because false confidence hides what needs to be formed. A student may know the language of financial literacy, needs, delayed gratification, without yet having the judgment to handle the increased autonomy well. And if awareness is treated as proof of readiness, the wrong conclusion can be drawn. They know things, but why aren't they doing it? This is not an argument against financial literacy. In fact, it's the opposite. It is an argument for a stronger, more honest definition of what good financial literacy should actually produce. If the aim is life readiness, then awareness alone cannot be the standard because awareness answers the question, have you heard about the idea? Readiness answers the question, can you think clearly and decide wisely when the situation is no longer neat? And I think schools need that second question much more. Because the real issue is not simply whether students know the right words. The real issue, the deeper issue, is whether they are ready to make wise decisions when freedom increases. So by now, I think the distinction becomes clearer. Financial knowledge is not the same as financial readiness. A student who can define the concept is not automatically a student who is ready for freedom attached to it. And I think that matters a lot in secondary school and older youth contexts where choice load, convenience, autonomy increase very quickly. So if schools want stronger outcomes, the aim cannot be only to produce informed students. The aim must be to develop students who can use judgment when it actually matters. So if a school wants to strengthen financial literacy for your older youth, here are 3 practical shifts. First, define readiness before you teach. Ask clearly, what kind of judgment should students demonstrate when the freedom increases? Because if readiness is not clearly defined, vocabulary can easily be mistaken for success. Second, design for widened choice, not just guided explanation. If you can, build scenarios with more options, competing priorities, ambiguous choices, realistic convenience, and put some form of social or short-term pressure there. See how they do. Because older youth need practice thinking well when the answer is very less obvious. Third, assess the judgment, not just recall. Don't stop asking whether students can define a concept. We should move beyond that. Ask, what trade-offs are you making? What are you prioritizing? What consequences are you willing to accept and bear? What influence your decision? How did you reason through that choice? Because readiness becomes more visible in reasoning under pressure than in polished concept recall. And I think the shift matters a great deal because if schools want financially wiser students, they cannot stop at financially informed students. If I had to summarize the entire issue in one line, it would be this: schools should build decision readiness, not just vocabulary. Because the goal of financial literacy is not informed spending, it is disciplined decision making.